In the spring of 1940, the world watched in disbelief as a military campaign unfolded with breathtaking speed and devastating consequences. What came to be known as the Battle of France was not simply a clash between armies, it was a test of strategies, ideologies, and the very balance of power in Europe. France, long regarded as one of the most formidable military powers on the continent, a nation whose victory in the Great War had cemented its reputation as a giant in European affairs, would fall in a matter of weeks. To the stunned observers across the globe, it seemed unthinkable. How could a nation with a vast army, fortified defenses, and powerful allies collapse in just 46 days? The answer lay in a new style of warfare, one that would change not only the course of the Second World War, but the future of modern combat itself. It was the Lightning War, Blitzkrieg. 4 months after the outbreak of World War II, in September 1939, there was an eerie calm in Western Europe. Germany had overrun Poland with astonishing speed, drawing Britain and France into the war. But then, a strange pause followed. Soldiers lined up across the borders, trenches were dug, and defensive fortifications were reinforced, but little actual fighting took place. This uneasy lull became known as the Phony War. For the French, it was a period of cautious confidence. Their grand fortification system, the Maginot Line, stretched across the eastern border, a concrete symbol of security, a modern wall that was supposed to keep the German war machine at bay. To many, it seemed that if Germany dared to advance, they would find themselves battered against this immovable French shield. But beneath the surface, the German high command was preparing something entirely new. Under Adolf Hitler's aggressive vision and the bold planning of his generals, Germany would not repeat the trench warfare stalemates of the First World War. They envisioned speed, shock, and precision. They would bypass the Maginot Line entirely, outmaneuvering the French defenses rather than battering against them. Tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry would surge forward in a coordinated strike so fast that the enemy would have no time to respond. This was not just an attack, it was a revolution in warfare, and it would soon be unleashed on France. When the German offensive began on May 10, 1940, it was as though a storm had erupted over Europe. The skies filled with the roar of the Luftwaffe, and armored divisions poured across borders. The attack was not concentrated only on France, it swept through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, dragging Allied forces into a vast battlefield that stretched from the Ardennes to the Channel coast. The French and British expected Germany to repeat the same strategy they had used in 1914, thrusting into Belgium in an attempt to outflank French defenses. Confident in this assumption, they rushed their best troops north to meet what they believed would be the main German thrust. But this was exactly what Hitler had anticipated. While the Allies scrambled to block German advances in Belgium, the real hammer strike came through the Ardennes dense, hilly forest region that the French believed to be nearly impassable for tanks. Yet it was here that Germany's armored spearhead broke through, surging westward in a lightning-fast maneuver that split the Allied armies in two. This move, known as the sickle cut, was devastatingly effective. Suddenly, vast numbers of Allied soldiers found themselves cut off from the rest of France, encircled and trapped along the northern coast. The effect was electrifying. In just days, the image of French military strength, built on decades of preparation and the prestige of victory in the First World War, German divisions moved with terrifying speed, supported by dive bombers that screamed down on roads, bridges, and communication lines, paralyzing the French response. It was as if the old rules of warfare had been ripped up and replaced with something new, something unstoppable. Civilians fled in panic as columns of refugees clogged the roads, mingling with retreating soldiers. The French government struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster unfolding, and around the world, military observers looked on with stunned disbelief. France, the mighty victor of 1918, was being brought to its knees in a matter of weeks. At the heart of this chaos lay a simple but brutal truth. The Germans were fighting a war of the future, while France and its allies were still preparing for a war of the past. The Maginot Line, so impressive as a monument of defensive engineering, was rendered almost meaningless. German tanks simply went around it, leaving the massive concrete fortresses isolated and irrelevant. The carefully laid Allied plans to defend Belgium and the Low Countries collapsed in the face of relentless German mobility. The traditional doctrines of attrition, careful preparation, and slow-moving campaigns proved powerless against the ruthless efficiency of Blitzkrieg. By the end of May, the situation for the Allies had become desperate. Hundreds of thousands of troops, British and French alike, were trapped against the sea near Dunkirk. Only a miraculous evacuation across the English Channel, later remembered as Operation Dynamo, saved them from complete annihilation. Over 338,000 soldiers were rescued, ferried to safety under constant German bombardment. But while this evacuation preserved the backbone of the British Army, it also underscored the depth of France's collapse. The country itself could not be evacuated. Its armies were in retreat, its government faltering, and its defenses shattered. On June 14th, German forces marched into Paris. The French capital, a city of beauty and culture, was surrendered without a fight, declared an open city to spare it destruction. Just over a week later, on June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany in the very same railway carriage, at where, 22 years earlier, the Germans had been forced to sign their own surrender in World War I. The symbolism was not lost on Hitler. He reveled in the moment, presenting it as Germany's revenge and the fulfillment of his promise to overturn the humiliation of 1918. For the French, it was a bitter humiliation that few could have imagined only weeks before. The Battle of France was over. In just 6 weeks, a campaign that the French and their allies had believed would be long and grueling had ended in complete catastrophe. France, one of the great powers of Europe, was now under German occupation. The map of the continent had been redrawn in fire and steel, and Britain stood alone as the last bastion of resistance in Western Europe. To the world, the shock was overwhelming. Military strategists everywhere studied the German methods with awe and dread. Could any army withstand this new kind of war? Could defenses, no matter how strong, stand against such speed and precision? The fall of France was more than a defeat, it was a revelation. It showed that the balance of power in Europe had shifted dramatically, and that the future of the war would be decided not by static lines of defense, but by the ability to adapt to the brutal new realities of mechanized warfare. The Battle of France lasted only 46 days, but its impact would echo throughout the war and beyond. It shattered illusions of security, exposed the dangers of complacency, and ushered in a new age of military conflict. The Lightning War had proven itself, and as the world looked on, stunned and fearful, one truth became clear: nothing in World War II would ever be the same again. The story of the Battle of France cannot be told without understanding the world that existed in the months and years leading up to May 1940. To many people in the late 1930s, France was still considered a great power, proud and resilient, a nation that had triumphed in the First World War and stood as a cornerstone of European stability. It had suffered terribly in that earlier conflict, millions dead, vast regions destroyed, entire generations scarred, but out of the rubble, France had emerged victorious. Alongside Britain and other allies, it had forced Germany to sign the humiliating Treaty of Versailles in 1919, a settlement that stripped Germany of its colonies, limited its army, and forced it to pay crippling reparations. To the French, Versailles was both justice and security. It was supposed to prevent another German threat from ever rising again. But time proved otherwise. The wounds of the First World War did not heal, they festered. In Germany, resentment grew. The restrictions of Versailles were seen not as justice, but as chains. National pride demanded revenge, and when Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he exploited this bitterness to fuel his vision of a reborn Reich. By the late 1930s, the world could see that Germany was no longer the crippled state Versailles had intended. Instead, it was rearming at a furious pace, expanding its army, building tanks and aircraft in defiance of treaties, and preparing for something much larger than mere rhetoric. France, meanwhile, faced its own challenges. Politically, the nation was deeply divided. The memory of the First World War had scarred not just its population, but also its leaders. French society was cautious, wary of aggression, and reluctant to endure another war of attrition like the one they had suffered from 1914 to 1918. Governments came and went, struggling to unite the people and balance a fragile democracy. Economically, France was still recovering from the Great Depression, with industry slowed and confidence shaken. Militarily, while it possessed a large army on paper, much of its strength was defensive, built around static fortifications and doctrines rooted in the past. And so, as Hitler began his aggressive march across Europe, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, annexing Austria in 1938, swallowing Czechoslovakia in 1939, France found itself reacting cautiously, often leaning on diplomacy, hesitant to strike unless Britain joined them. France had alliances with smaller nations like Poland and Belgium, but the country's leadership understood that without Britain's support, fighting Germany would be nearly impossible. The real breaking point came in September 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of that month. Britain and France, bound by treaty, declared war on Germany. For a brief moment, it seemed as though history might repeat itself. Germany, facing a two-front war, just as it had in 1914, with France and Britain to the west and Poland to the east. But the reality was very different. Poland fell in just over 4 weeks, overwhelmed by German Blitzkrieg tactics. And by mid-September, the Soviet Union invaded from the east under the terms of its pact with Hitler. France and Britain, despite their declarations of war, made no immediate move against Germany. This led to one of the strangest periods in modern military history, the so-called Phony War. For 8 months, from September 1939 until May 1940, there was little direct fighting on the Western Front. French troops manned their positions behind the Maginot Line, Britain sent the British Expeditionary Force across the Channel to support them, and German soldiers waited on the opposite side of the frontier. Apart from occasional skirmishes and air raids, the war seemed almost unreal. Soldiers wrote letters home, played cards in the trenches, and waited. Civilians carried on with daily life, uneasy but not yet directly touched by the violence. For many in France, this period offered false reassurance. The Maginot Line, a massive network of bunkers, artillery cachemates, and underground railways stretching along the German border, seemed impregnable. Politicians reassured their people that the line would keep them safe, that France was prepared, and that if Germany tried to break through, it would pay a terrible price. Yet the Maginot Line itself reflected an outdated mindset. The belief that wars would once again be fought like the last one, with static lines, defensive positions, and slow grinding battles of attrition. France was preparing to refight 1914 to 1918. Germany was preparing to fight a completely different war. The contrast in military doctrine was stark. French generals believed in caution, in holding strong defensive lines, and in conserving manpower. Their tanks, though technically advanced in some models, were dispersed among infantry units, rather than concentrated into armored. Their air force, though sizable, was not integrated into ground operations the way the German Luftwaffe was. French planning was deliberate, methodical, but slow. In the event of a German attack, French and British strategy was to push into Belgium to block the invasion. Just as they had in the First World War, Germany, by contrast, had embraced Blitzkrieg lightning war. This doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and coordination. Armored divisions would smash through weak points in the enemy line, supported by aircraft that destroyed communication, logistics, and morale. Once a breach was created, tanks and mechanized infantry would pour through, encircling the enemy before they had time to react. Blitzkrieg was about collapsing an opponent's system rather than wearing them down in attritional battles. Where France saw war as a marathon, Germany saw it as a sprint designed to paralyze and overwhelm. The Allies underestimated not only Germany's new tactics but also its daring. The French believed the Ardennes forest, a dense, rugged region stretching across Luxembourg, Belgium, and northern France, was impassable to large mechanized forces. They expected any German attack to repeat the Schlieffen Plan of 1914, sweeping through northern Belgium into France. Accordingly, their best armies were positioned in the north, ready to rush forward into Belgium the moment Germany moved. This left the Ardennes thinly defended, a weakness Germany would soon exploit with devastating effect. Meanwhile, the French population waited nervously. Memories of the last war haunted them. In towns and villages, men were mobilized, families were separated, and whispers spread about what the Germans might attempt. Yet there was also a sense of denial, of disbelief that the storm would truly come. Could Germany really dare to challenge France again, just 20 years after its crushing defeat in the First World War? And if it did, surely France and Britain together could hold them back. But Hitler was confident. He saw the divisions among his enemies, the hesitations of France, the isolation of Britain, and he believed that if he could strike fast enough, he could win before the Allies had time to fully mobilize. For him, conquering France was not only about military strategy, but also about prestige, revenge, and cementing German dominance in Western Europe. The memory of 1918 weighed heavily on him. In his mind, the defeat of France would not just secure Germany's western flank, it would erase the humiliation of Versailles and prove that the Third Reich was unstoppable. By May 1940, the stage was set. The phony war was about to end. Across the French countryside, soldiers stood guard in their trenches, officers studied their maps, and politicians in Paris clung to hopes of a long defensive struggle. In Britain, leaders like Winston Churchill, who had just become prime minister, prepared for the fight they knew was coming. And in Germany, armored divisions rumbled into position, their crews waiting for the order that would unleash one of the most daring and decisive campaigns in modern history. When the attack came, it would not be a slow grind nor a cautious advance. It would be sudden, overwhelming, and catastrophic. France believed it was prepared. In truth, it was about to be shaken to its very core. The background of the Battle of France was one of complacency, miscalculation, and faith in old strategies. What followed would prove just how dangerous those illusions could be. War is often shaped not just by the weapons wielded, but by the ideas that guide them. In 1940, the German military did not simply march into France with tanks and planes. They carried with them a new philosophy of war, one that shattered centuries of conventional thinking. This was Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. To truly grasp how France collapsed in only 6 weeks, we must first understand Blitzkrieg. The term itself conjures images of unstoppable armored columns racing across fields, dive bombers screaming from the skies, and enemy forces collapsing in panic. But Blitzkrieg was more than speed. It was about coordination, about overwhelming an opponent not just physically but psychologically. It combined strategy, tactics, and technology into a single terrifying weapon. At the heart of Blitzkrieg was the principle of concentration. Instead of spreading forces evenly along a wide front, German planners believed in striking hard at a narrow point. This was the Schwerpunkt, the focal point, the spearhead of the attack. Here, tanks, mechanized infantry, and artillery would be massed together, supported by relentless air power. Once the enemy's line cracked, the Germans would pour through the breach, driving deep into enemy territory before defenders could regroup. This was not about holding ground, it was about paralyzing the enemy's system. The speed of Blitzkrieg was essential. In the First World War, offensives often stalled because armies could not move fast enough to exploit breakthroughs. By the time soldiers advanced across muddy trenches and artillery-ravaged fields, the enemy had rushed reinforcements into place. The Germans of 1940 sought to avoid this trap by harnessing modern mobility. Tanks, trucks, and motorized infantry could move far faster than the horse-drawn wagons of 1914. Aircraft could strike ahead of advancing troops, sowing chaos behind enemy lines. Radios allowed real-time communication between units, ensuring that attacks could adapt to changing conditions instantly. The combination of mobility, communication, and shock created a storm that few armies could withstand. Nowhere was this doctrine more vividly applied than in the planning for the invasion of France. In late 1939 and early 1940, Germany's generals debated how to attack. The obvious plan the Allies expected was a repeat of 1914, a wide sweep through Belgium, outflanking French defenses and pushing toward Paris. This plan, however, carried risks. The French and British were ready for it. Their armies were positioned to rush into Belgium the moment Germany moved, blocking the advance. But one-man General Erich von Manstein proposed something bolder. Instead of making Belgium the main thrust, he suggested it should be the bait, while German forces pushed into the Low Countries. Drawing the bulk of French and British armies northward, the true strike would come through the Ardennes. This forested, hilly region was considered unsuitable for large mechanized forces. French planners dismissed the possibility of a major attack there, but Manstein believed that if Germany could push tanks through the Ardennes, they could break into northern France, reach the Channel coast, and cut off the Allied armies entirely. Hitler seized on the idea. The plan became known as the Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut. In theory, it was simple. Lure the Allies into Belgium, then drive a blade through their exposed flank, encircling them. In practice, it was daring to the point of recklessness. Moving hundreds of tanks through the narrow roads of the Ardennes was a logistical nightmare. If the French discovered the maneuver early, the German spearhead could be destroyed in the forest, trapped and vulnerable. But Hitler believed that the gamble would succeed. And in May 1940, the world saw that gamble pay off with devastating effect. Blitzkrieg did not just rely on tanks and strategy, it depended heavily on air power. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was designed not as a strategic bombing force like the Allies, but as a direct instrument of battlefield domination. Its most infamous weapon was the Junkers Ru-87 Stuka bomber. With its wailing sirens, the Jericho trumpets, the Stuka became a psychological weapon as much as a destructive one. When it dove upon its target, the scream of its sirens spread terror among soldiers and civilians alike. Bridges, supply lines, and communication hubs were prime targets, crippling the enemy's ability to respond. Meanwhile, fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 ensured that German bombers operated with relative freedom in the skies. This integration of air and ground forces was revolutionary. French and British commanders tended to see air forces as separate arms, often reserved for strategic bombing or defensive patrols. The Germans, by contrast, used them as flying artillery, striking at exactly the right moment to support armored thrusts. If resistance stiffened, the Luftwaffe smashed it. If enemy reserves were on the move, the Luftwaffe strafed the columns before they even reached the battlefield. The result was a seamless wave of destruction, one that left defenders feeling powerless, unable to regroup before the next blow fell. Another critical component of Blitzkrieg was its psychological impact. Speed and surprise were not just tactical tools, they were weapons of terror. Armies that expected weeks or months of preparation suddenly found themselves encircled in days. Commanders lost communication as radios and lines were destroyed. Soldiers, cut off and surrounded, panicked. Civilians, fleeing in massive refugee columns, clogged the roads, further paralyzing military movement. This cascading sense of collapse often defeated opponents long before their armies were physically destroyed. In France, entire divisions disintegrated not because they were annihilated in battle, but because they lost cohesion, morale, and the will to fight. In practical terms, the German strategy for the Battle of France unfolded like a trap snapping shut. On May 10, 1940, German forces surged into Belgium and the Netherlands. As expected, the Allies responded by sending their best armies north, including the British Expeditionary Force. the Germans pressed hard in the Low Countries, creating the impression that this was the main thrust. But meanwhile, through the supposedly impassable Ardennes, three panzer armies pushed forward, led by generals such as Heinz, Guderian, and Erwin Rommel. The Ardennes campaign was a feat of endurance and coordination. German tank columns snaked through narrow roads, often creating traffic jams that stretched for miles. A single determined French airstrike or ambush could have turned the maneuver into disaster. Yet fortune, preparation, and Allied hesitation combined in Germany's favor. The French had stationed only weak divisions in the Ardennes, convinced that any major attack there was impossible. When German tanks burst out of the forest and reached the River Meuse, the French were unprepared. On May 13th, German forces crossed at Sedan, supported by a massive Luftwaffe assault that shattered French defenses. Within days, the Germans were advancing across open country, their panzers racing toward the Channel. This was Blitzkrieg at its most terrifying. In less than 2 weeks, the German sickle cut had succeeded. The Allied armies in Belgium found themselves encircled, their supply lines severed, their retreat paths cut off. The speed of the German advance shocked not only the French and British but also the Germans themselves. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division advanced so quickly it earned the nickname Ghost Division, because even German headquarters often lost track of its position. The brilliance of Blitzkrieg lay not just in its tactics but in its timing. Every element was coordinated to create maximum chaos. Tanks struck at weak points, infantry secured the flanks, aircraft silenced defenders, and all moved with relentless momentum. There was no pause, no time for the enemy to recover. Each German advance created conditions for the next, like falling dominoes, and once the chain reaction began, it was almost impossible to stop. For France, Blitzkrieg was devastating because it attacked the very foundation of their strategy. The Maginot Line was irrelevant when the enemy simply bypassed it. Slow-moving reserves could not plug gaps when the enemy advanced hundreds of kilometers in days. The French command structure, built on deliberate planning and rigid orders, could not adapt quickly enough to the fluid chaos of Blitzkrieg. By the time France understood what was happening, their armies were already split, their communications shattered, and their options dwindling. Blitzkrieg was not flawless. It depended on risk, on overextended supply lines, on daring commanders willing to push beyond safe limits. In 1940, these risks paid off spectacularly. Later in the war, as in Russia, the weaknesses of Blitzkrieg would be exposed. But in the Battle of France, against an enemy unprepared for its speed and innovation, Blitzkrieg proved itself to be the most devastating military doctrine of the age. And so, the German strategy in 1940 was not just about defeating France, it was about redefining war itself. The Lightning War was a storm that swept across Europe, leaving shock and ruin in its path. It was the blade of the sickle cutting through the heart of France, a weapon forged not just from steel and fire, but from imagination, daring, and ruthless execution. In 6 short weeks, it would bring down a nation that had once been considered invincible. And it all began with the strike of Blitzkrieg. The Battle of France was not a single clash, but a whirlwind campaign of interconnected battles, maneuvers, and desperate decisions, unfolding between May 10th and June 22, 1940. In just 46 days, the destiny of nations was rewritten. This section will follow the campaign step by step, as the storm of Blitzkrieg swept across Western Europe. The invasion begins. May 10, 1940. On the morning of May 10, 1940, the silence of the phony war was broken. Without warning, Germany unleashed its full offensive across Western Europe. It was a meticulously coordinated strike. Paratroopers descended from the skies. Tanks roared across borders, and the Luftwaffe darkened the skies with their bombers. The first blows fell on the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Hitler's plan relied on using these smaller nations as both stepping stones and bait. By attacking them, he ensured the Allies would rush their best forces northward. And indeed, as German troops poured into the Low Countries, the French and British responded exactly as expected, sending powerful armies into Belgium to block what they believed was the main German thrust. In Belgium, the Germans executed a daring operation that became legendary: the assault on Fort Eben-Mel, a supposedly impregnable fortress guarding key bridges and crossings. German paratroopers used gliders to land silently on the roof of the fortress, placing explosive charges that disabled its guns within hours. It was a stunning demonstration of surprise and precision. With the fortress neutralized, German troops pushed rapidly into Belgium, forcing the Allies to engage. The lure in the trap, while the Allies fought desperately in Belgium, the real German masterstroke was unfolding elsewhere. Through the dense and supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, 3 German panzer armies were on the move. For days, they inched their way through narrow, winding roads, their armored columns stretching for miles. French intelligence dismissed the danger. They believed the Ardennes could not sustain a major armored offensive, but the Germans proved otherwise. By May 12, tanks under generals like Heinz Guderian reached the River Meuse near Sedan. The French defenders were weak, poorly equipped, and unprepared for what came next. On May 13, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments of the war, pounding French positions for hours. When the tanks surged forward, resistance collapsed. Within days, German forces had crossed the Meuse and burst into the open countryside. The sickle cut had begun. The breakthrough, May 15 to 20th, as German tanks poured out of the Ardennes. Panic spread through French ranks. This was not where the main attack was expected, and reserves were too slow to respond. Guderian's divisions advanced with breathtaking speed, sometimes covering over 60 kilometers in a single day. Civilians fled in terror, clogging the roads with carts and cars, making it even harder for French units to maneuver. By May 15, French Prime Minister Paul Renaud telephoned British Prime Minister Winston Churchill with despair in his voice. His words were stark: "We are defeated. We have lost the battle." Churchill was stunned. How could France, with its vast army, be collapsing so soon? But the reality was undeniable. The German spearheads drove relentlessly westward. By May 20th, just 10 days after the offensive began, German tanks reached the English Channel near Abbeville. The sickle cut was complete. The bulk of the Allied armies, French, Belgian, and the British Expeditionary Force, were now trapped in northern Belgium and Flanders, cut off from the rest of France. The encirclement tightens. May 21st to 25th, the Allies launched desperate counterattacks to break free. At Arras on May 21st, British tanks, including the heavily armored Matilda Eyes, briefly shocked the Germans, inflicting heavy casualties on Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. For a moment, panic rippled through German ranks, and some commanders feared a collapse. But the counterattack lacked coordination in numbers. The Germans quickly regrouped, using their air superiority to smash the assault. With the encirclement tightening, German forces surged northward, threatening to trap the Allies completely. Refugee streams of civilians fleeing south collided with retreating soldiers, creating chaos and despair. Belgian defenses were crumbling. Dutch forces had already surrendered, and the British faced the possibility of total destruction. Dunkirk, May 26 to June 4th. As German panzers approached the northern coast, the British Expeditionary Force and large numbers of French troops were trapped around the port of Dunkirk. It seemed certain they would be annihilated. But then, a strange decision changed the course of events. Hitler ordered his advancing tanks to halt for several days, leaving the Luftwaffe to finish the job. The reasons remain debated. Some argue it was to preserve armored strength for the push into France. Others that Hermann Göring promised his air force could crush the pocket alone. This pause gave the Allies precious time. In Britain, Operation Dynamo was launched, a desperate evacuation across the English Channel. From May 26 to June 4th, a flotilla of over 800 vessels, Navy destroyers, merchant ships, and even fishing boats and pleasure craft ferried trapped soldiers to safety. Under constant German bombardment, over 338,000 troops were evacuated, including 198,000 British and 140,000 French. It was a miracle, but also a tragedy. The Allies saved their men, but most of their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, was abandoned. Dunkirk was a symbol of both survival and defeat. The soldiers were saved, but France itself was left exposed. The fall of Belgium and collapse of the front, May 28, June 5. On May 28, Belgium formally surrendered after its army was overwhelmed, leaving the northern flank of the French exposed. With the British evacuated, the Germans turned their full might southward. This began the second phase of the campaign, sometimes called the Battle of France proper. The Germans now struck directly into central France, aiming for Paris. By this time, French morale was collapsing. The army, already battered and disorganized, could not reform quickly enough. Refugees streamed south by the millions, creating an atmosphere of panic. Churchill urged the French to fight on, promising British support, but France was fracturing politically. In Paris, leaders debated whether to abandon the capital or defend it street by street. General Charles de Gaulle, commanding a division, launched small but determined counterattacks, earning his reputation as a rising figure. But these efforts were isolated and insufficient. The fall of Paris, June 10 to 14th, as June began, the Germans advanced almost unopposed. On June 10, Italy declared war on France, hoping to share in the spoils of victory. For France, it was a crushing blow, attacked now from both north and south. On June 13, the French government fled Paris, declaring it an open city to avoid destruction. The next day, June 14, 1940, German troops marched into the French capital. The sight was surreal. Nazi flags unfurled over the Eiffel Tower. German patrols marched down the Champs, and Parisians watched in shock and silence as their city fell without a fight. For the world, it was a moment that symbolized the collapse of French resistance. The armistice, June 17 to 22, by mid-June, French resistance was crumbling everywhere. Prime Minister Renaud resigned. replaced by Marshal Philippe, the elderly World War I hero, quickly sought an armistice with Germany, believing further resistance would only destroy what remained of France. On June 17th, he announced on the radio, "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that we must stop fighting." For many French citizens, it was devastating news. Some still wanted to resist, while others felt relief that the nightmare was ending. Hitler, savoring his triumph, chose a site for the armistice signing filled with symbolism, the same railway carriage, at where Germany had surrendered in 1918. On June 22, 1940, French officials signed the armistice, dividing France into zones, the north and west under German occupation, and the south under the puppet Vichy government. The humiliation was complete. In less than 7 weeks, France had fallen. The aftermath of the key events, the Battle of France, was over, but its consequences would shape the rest of the war. France, once considered Europe's strongest land power, had been crushed with shocking speed. Britain now stood alone against Nazi Germany. Hitler believed the war was all but won, and he turned his eyes to the next challenge, the invasion of Britain. But the story of France's fall did not end with defeat. From exile, Charles de Gaulle issued his famous appeal of June 18th, calling on the French to continue resisting, planting the seeds of the Free French movement. In the occupied territories, resistance groups would slowly emerge. And for the Allies, the lessons of 1940 were seared into their minds. Never again would they underestimate the speed and coordination of modern mechanized warfare. The Battle of France was a whirlwind campaign that unfolded with terrifying speed and devastating precision. From the daring airborne assault on Fort Ébène to the shocking breakthrough at Sedan, from the miracle of Dunkirk to the silent fall of Paris, each event was a piece of a larger storm. In just 46 days, the old order in Europe collapsed, and a new, darker chapter began. The fall of France in June 1940 was more than a shocking military defeat. It was a seismic event that reshaped the political, military, and psychological landscape of Europe, setting the stage for the next phase of World War II. The consequences of this rapid collapse rippled across the continent, redefining alliances, strategies, and perceptions of power. For France itself, the defeat was not only a humiliation but the beginning of a profound national trauma that would shape the country for decades to come. Almost immediately after the armistice was signed on June 22, 1940, Germany set about restructuring France to consolidate its dominance. The country was divided into distinct zones, each serving specific purposes for the occupying power. In the north and west, Germany imposed direct control, stationing troops, commandeering infrastructure, and integrating the territory into the Nazi war machine. Major cities, industrial centers, and ports were carefully managed to maximize exploitation of resources and to secure strategic control over the Atlantic coast. The German occupation authorities enforced strict control over daily life, introducing curfews, censorship, and brutal policing designed to prevent resistance and maintain a climate of fear. Meanwhile, the southern part of France was left under the administration of the so-called Vichy regime, named after the spa town that became its capital. Led by Marshal Philippe, a World War I hero, this government presented itself as a symbol of continuity and order. Claiming to maintain French sovereignty, in reality, Vichy France operated as a puppet state, collaborating with German authorities while pursuing policies that aligned with Nazi interests. Vichy's leaders implemented authoritarian laws, restricted civil liberties, and participated in the deportation of Jews and other groups targeted by Nazi racial policies. For many French citizens, the South offered a semblance of safety and normalcy. But this was a fragile illusion, as the Vichy government's collaboration undermined national pride and created deep divisions within French society. The division of France had profound psychological consequences. For the French people, it was a humiliation unlike any other. A nation that had survived the horrors of the First World War, that had prided itself on its military traditions and industrial strength, had been shattered in just 6 weeks. The sight of German troops marching into Paris, the occupation of key cities, and the imposition of foreign rule inflicted a collective trauma on a population that had long considered itself a cornerstone of European stability. The abruptness of the collapse challenged beliefs in military preparedness, governmental competence, and the very resilience of the French nation. The trauma would leave scars not only on the survivors of the campaign, but also on generations who grew up under occupation or in exile, shaping the French identity in ways that were both political and cultural. Beyond France, the consequences of the campaign were equally momentous for the rest of Europe. With France out of the war, Britain found itself standing alone against Nazi Germany. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving the United Kingdom as the last major European power resisting Hitler's expansion. The fall of France exposed the vulnerability of the Allies and underscored the threat that Germany now posed. Britain faced an existential challenge, defending the homeland from potential invasion. maintaining supply lines, and sustaining morale amid the knowledge that much of continental Europe was now under German control. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, newly in office, understood the gravity of the situation. His speeches from 1940 reflect the precarious position of Britain, emphasizing resilience, determination, and the unyielding resolve to resist at all costs. The country mobilized for total war, preparing defenses along the coast, rationing resources, and rallying public sentiment to face what would become the Battle of Britain. For Germany, the victory in France brought enormous material and strategic gains. The industrial heartland of northern France, the ports along the Atlantic coast, and the agricultural resources of the countryside all came under German control. Factories and infrastructure were repurposed to supply the war effort, providing machinery, raw materials, and a labor force to fuel Germany's continued expansion. The fall of France also secured strategic dominance in Western Europe, granting the Wehrmacht secure lines of communication, access to the Atlantic for naval operations, and a launchpad for potential operations against Britain. Germany could now turn its attention to the next phases of Hitler's ambitions, confident that its western flank was secure and that France would no longer pose a threat to its northern borders. Militarily, the rapid conquest of France validated the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg, a strategy that combined speed, concentration, and coordination in ways the world had never seen before. The collapse of the French army, despite its size and resources, demonstrated that traditional doctrines of static defense, dispersed forces, and slow-moving reserves were vulnerable to modern mechanized warfare. The lessons of the campaign reverberated across the globe. Nations realized that modern wars could be won or lost through mobility, innovation, and decisive strikes, rather than through attritional grinding battles. The Allied High Command, shocked by the speed and precision of the German advance, would spend the rest of the war adapting strategies, reorganizing forces, and learning how to counter such tactics. The Battle of France thus became a case study in the transformative nature of modern warfare. The consequences of the fall of France extended beyond immediate military and political calculations. They also reshaped the psychological and ideological dimensions of the war. Hitler's triumph emboldened the Nazi regime, reinforcing a sense of invincibility and feeding the ideology of German supremacy. Across occupied Europe, the fall of France sent a chilling message to other nations. Resistance was possible, but it came with enormous risk, and the power of Blitzkrieg was real. Occupied nations from Belgium to the Netherlands, Norway to Denmark watched closely, recognizing that Nazi Germany now had the capability to impose its will on Europe with unprecedented speed and efficiency. At the same time, the collapse altered the perception of the Allies. Britain could no longer rely on the immediate support of continental powers, and had to assume the role of the primary bulwark against Hitler. This strategic isolation forced the United Kingdom to innovate in technology, intelligence, and diplomacy. Radar, cryptography, and air defense strategies became essential, while the Royal Air Force prepared for the coming conflict in the skies that would become the Battle of Britain. The fall of France underscored the importance of coordination among the remaining Allied powers and highlighted the need for transatlantic support, planting the seeds for the eventual partnership with the United States. Politically, the consequences of France's defeat were profound. The establishment of the Vichy regime created a complex and morally fraught situation within France itself. Collaboration, resistance, and survival became intertwined in ways that would divide the nation for decades. Some citizens cooperated with the occupiers, believing it necessary for their safety or for the preservation of some semblance of French governance. Others fled abroad, joining Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle or contributing to resistance movements. The moral and political dilemmas posed by occupation would define French society, culture, and politics long after the war ended. Economically, the occupation allowed Germany to draw upon French resources in unprecedented ways. Industrial facilities were dismantled or repurposed. Agricultural production was redirected to support the German war effort, and transportation networks were exploited for military logistics. The seizure of resources strengthened Germany, a strategic position, and prolonged its ability to conduct large-scale operations in Western Europe and beyond. At the same time, the French economy suffered under the weight of occupation, rationing, and the destruction of infrastructure, leaving lasting scars on the country's post-war recovery. The collapse also accelerated the evolution of modern warfare doctrine. Military leaders around the world, witnessing the consequences of inaction, rapid maneuvering, and integrated combined arms tactics, began re-evaluating their approaches to defense and offense. The effectiveness of Blitzkrieg forced armies to rethink the roles of tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry, emphasizing flexibility, speed, and the integration of intelligence and communication. The lessons of the Battle of France would echo throughout the war, shaping campaigns in North Africa, the Soviet Union, and the eventual Allied invasion of Western Europe. Perhaps the most enduring consequence was psychological, for both Axis and Allied powers. the Battle of France sent a powerful signal about what was possible in modern warfare. For Germany, it reinforced the belief that boldness, speed, and coordination could overcome even the largest and most established armies. For the Allies, it was a harsh reminder of the dangers of underestimating the enemy and relying on outdated strategies. The rapid fall of France instilled fear, urgency, and a recognition that the nature of conflict had fundamentally changed, a lesson that would inform military planning for the remainder of World War II. Finally, the consequences of France's defeat were also global in scope. The strategic dominance gained by Germany in Western Europe allowed the Nazis to dictate terms to neighboring countries and threaten the balance of power worldwide. The United States, still officially neutral, observed the collapse with growing concern. Realizing that Europe's balance had shifted dramatically, countries in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and Scandinavia understood that the conflict could spread rapidly, and neutral nations reassessed their own defense strategies in light of Germany's demonstrated capability. In essence, the consequences of the Battle of France were multifaceted and transformative. France was divided, humiliated, and partially occupied, while a collaborationist government administered the South. Britain stood alone, facing the prospect of invasion and forced to adapt to a new strategic reality. Germany gained territory, resources, and industrial power while proving the devastating effectiveness of Blitzkrieg. The campaign marked a turning point in World War II, fundamentally altering military doctrine, Allied strategy, and the psychological landscape of the conflict. The events of those 6 weeks in 1940 reshaped Europe, leaving legacies of occupation, resistance, and innovation that would influence the course of the war and the post-war world for decades to come. The Battle of France in 1940 was more than a 6-week military campaign. It became a defining moment in modern history. Its rapid conclusion shocked the world, leaving nations in disbelief and shaping the trajectory of World War II for years to come. Beyond the immediate military and political consequences, the battle left a lasting legacy on strategy, morale, and the collective consciousness of Europe and the world. Understanding this legacy is key to appreciating the profound impact that those 46 days had on the course of the 20th century. One of the most striking legacies of the battle was its stark illustration of the speed and effectiveness of the German Blitzkrieg. Until May 19, the prevailing assumption among military planners was that war in Europe would resemble the trench warfare of World War I, slow, attritional, and fought primarily along fortified lines. France, in particular, had invested heavily in static defenses, such as the Maginot Line, expecting that fortifications and numerical superiority would be enough to hold the German army at bay. Yet, how the rapidity with which German forces overran the Low Countries and then penetrated the Ardennes shattered these assumptions. Within weeks, the seemingly invincible French army was in disarray. Paris had fallen, and millions of soldiers were trapped, retreating, or surrendering. The world watched in disbelief as a modern military doctrine, speed, coordination, and the integrated use of tanks, infantry, and aircraft completely outclassed traditional approaches. Blitzkrieg was no longer a concept on paper. It had been proven devastatingly effective in practice. This display of German military power became a symbol, not only of the efficiency of Nazi strategy, but also of the failure of Allied preparation. France's rapid defeat highlighted deep flaws in Allied planning, communication, and doctrine. Despite warnings and intelligence reports, the Allies were slow to adapt to the realities of mechanized warfare. The assumption that Germany would repeat the mistakes of the First World War blinded French and British commanders to the possibility of rapid armored thrusts through unexpected terrain. This failure extended beyond the battlefield to political and strategic decisions, misjudgments about German intentions, a lack of coordination between French and British forces, and the inability to respond flexibly to dynamic situations all contributed to the disaster. In the years that followed, military historians and strategists would repeatedly examine the Battle of France as a cautionary tale of complacency, rigid doctrine, and underestimation of an innovative enemy. Yet, even amid the devastation, the fall of France inspired future Allied resolve, particularly in Britain. As the Germans celebrated their triumph, Britain stood alone against the seemingly unstoppable Nazi war machine. The evacuation of Dunkirk, though technically a retreat, became a symbol of resilience and determination. Over 330,000 soldiers were rescued, their survival allowing Britain to continue the fight when all hope seemed lost. This event, coupled with the stark lesson of France's defeat, galvanized British leadership and society. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, understanding both the military and symbolic stakes, delivered speeches that would become legendary, rallying the nation to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds. The fall of France, paradoxically, became a catalyst for courage. It forced the British to innovate, to reorganize their forces, and to develop strategies that would carry them through the Battle of Britain and the broader conflict. The lesson was clear. Even when faced with monumental setbacks, resilience and ingenuity could change the course of history. On a broader scale, the rapid defeat of France reshaped geopolitics in Europe. Countries that had previously assumed that the balance of power was stable were now forced to reconsider their positions. Neutral nations, from Scandinavia to the Balkans, observed the speed and decisiveness of German operations with alarm, realizing that Europe's security architecture had been fundamentally upended. The fall of France also forced the United States, still officially neutral, to grapple with the reality of Nazi dominance on the continent. American policymakers recognized that the war was no longer a distant European conflict, but a direct threat to global stability. The political ripples of France's defeat extended far beyond the borders of Western Europe, influencing diplomacy, alliances, and military planning for years to come. The human dimension of the legacy was equally profound. In France, as the division between the German-occupied North and West and the Vichy-administered South created a complex social and moral landscape. Collaboration, resistance, survival, and defiance became intertwined in ways that would haunt the nation long after the guns fell silent. Millions of French citizens experienced occupation, first-hand living under curfews, rationing, forced labor, and constant surveillance. For many, the humiliation and disruption left deep psychological scars. Families were separated, communities were torn apart, and the fabric of society was strained under the weight of oppression and fear. Yet, in the shadow of defeat, courage and resistance also emerged. Underground networks, clandestine publications, and acts of defiance formed the backbone of what would later become the French resistance, a testament to the enduring spirit of those unwilling to submit to tyranny. From a military perspective, the Battle of France became a case study in the power of modern warfare. The campaign demonstrated how speed, coordination, and integration of arms could overcome even the most formidable static defenses. Tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry, working in concert, created a shock effect that paralyzed the enemy, disrupted communication, and shattered morale. The lessons learned would influence both Axis and Allied strategy throughout the remainder of the war. The Allies, humbled by the failure in France, adapted rapidly, prioritizing mobility, intelligence, and combined arms operations in future campaigns. The Germans, meanwhile, gained confidence in their approach, though this overconfidence would later contribute to critical mistakes in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. The Battle of France, therefore, was not just an isolated event. It was a turning point that reshaped the conduct of warfare in the 20th century. Economically and strategically, Germany's gains were immense. The occupation of northern and western France provided access to industrial centers, agricultural resources, and key ports on the Atlantic. These assets strengthened Germany's ability to sustain large-scale operations. From U-boat campaigns in the Atlantic to preparations for potential invasions of Britain, France's defeat also gave Germany a secure western flank, allowing the Wehrmacht to redirect focus eastward without fear of immediate retaliation. The strategic advantage was significant. Germany could now operate with greater freedom, expand its sphere of influence, and consolidate power across the continent. Politically, the consequences rippled through the leadership of the remaining Allied powers. Britain, isolated and threatened, forged a new identity as the defender of Europe, capable of sustaining resistance despite adversity. Charles de Gaulle, operating from London, began organizing the Free French forces, calling upon the nation to resist and maintain a sense of national pride. The idea of liberation, though distant, took root in occupied territories, creating hope and motivating clandestine operations that would grow in scale over the coming years. The Battle of France, in this sense, was not just a moment of defeat. It became a crucible for the emergence of leadership, resistance, and long-term strategy. Symbolically, the battle illustrated the fragility of established power structures. France, with its history, military tradition, and industrial capability, fell in just over 6 weeks. The world was forced to confront the reality that military power alone was not sufficient without flexibility, innovation, and adaptability. The shock reverberated across continents, influencing public perception, national morale, and even popular culture. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels carried images of German tanks rolling through French towns, citizens fleeing in panic, and cities under occupation. These images became iconic, representing both the terror of modern warfare and the vulnerability of nations unprepared for rapid, mechanized conflict. The legacy of the Battle of France also includes its influence on strategic thought and planning. Military academies and strategists worldwide analyzed the campaign in detail, extracting lessons about mobility, communication, combined arms, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. The importance of air superiority, rapid decision-making, and coordinated attacks became central to military doctrine. Allied planners, humbled by the experience, invested heavily in training, technology, and logistics, ensuring that future campaigns, whether in North Africa, Italy, or Normandy, would incorporate these hard-won lessons. Finally, the Battle of France remains a cautionary tale of the interplay between politics, strategy, and human decision-making. It shows how rapid innovation, bold leadership, and daring tactics can overcome even the most seemingly formidable defenses. At the same time, it demonstrates the consequences of underestimating an adversary, failing to adapt, and clinging to outdated doctrines. The fall of France in 1940 serves as both a warning and a source of insight for military historians, political analysts, and anyone seeking to understand the dynamics of power, strategy, and resilience. In closing, the legacy of the Battle of France is profound and enduring. It stands as a symbol of rapid German success and Allied failure, a moment that reshaped European geopolitics and demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Blitzkrieg. It inspired future Allied resolve, particularly Britain's determined stand during the Battle of Britain. It shocked the world, leaving an indelible mark on the consciousness of nations and the strategies of armies. Above all, it reminds us that even in moments of overwhelming defeat, courage, adaptation, and the will to resist can emerge, shaping the future in ways that are both unpredictable and profound. As we reflect on these events, we are reminded that history is not just a series of dates and battles, it is a story of people, decisions, courage, and consequences. The lessons of France in 1940 continue to resonate. The importance of preparation, the value of adaptability, and the enduring human capacity to confront adversity with resilience. If you found this journey through the Battle of France compelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons do you think modern nations can learn from the rapid fall of France in 1940? Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of history brought to life. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family, because understanding the past helps us navigate the future. History is not just about remembering dates. It's about learning from courage, mistakes, and triumphs. The Battle of France may have ended in defeat for one nation, but its lessons, stories of resilience, and impact on global history continue to shape our world today. Remember, every event in history, no matter how distant, carries echoes that reach into our present and future.